Dear viewers, now our guest is Mr. Kramarenko Alexander Mikhailovich. Mr. Mikhailovich is the director of the Institute of Current International Problems of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Kramarenko, welcome to this interview.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
First of all, we'd like to say that on June 27, during a debate, former US President Donald Trump clearly saying Ukraine is losing the war and running short of soldiers. Under this scenario, in your opinion, why is Joe Biden and his NATO allies still emphasizing on sending billions of dollars to Kiev, and what may happen after the collapse of Zelensky regime?
Yes, I think that the main problem in Ukraine is that this is a geopolitical conflict between Russia and the West. And the Kiev regime, they have agreed to be a front state in this proxy war of the West against Russia. It has a long, I think that our relationship with the West has a long history dating back to the first half of the 13th century, when the West was unified under the Catholic Church, under the Pope. And in this particular stage of our conflict, after the end of the Cold War, the West considered himself to be a victor in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But Russia is not a Soviet Union. We have given up on ideology of the Soviet Union, on communism and things like that. And we wanted to have a constructive partnership with the West. And some clever people in the West at that time, they thought that it was time for America in particular to leave Europe, to dismantle NATO, and to start managing its own affairs. But as a matter of political inertia, the ruling elite of the West, of the Western nations, and under the American leadership, they wanted to continue to dominate the world. They thought if the Soviet system collapsed and the Soviet Union was no longer there, then the global domination of the West will continue to expand automatically. That's why they did nothing to solve the problems of the international community after the end of the Cold War, because they thought that the market will settle everything, will sort things out in every problem. So we were supposed, and some American experts like Tom Graham, he did say that the problem for Russia with America was that we didn't recognize that we Russia, lost the Cold War. And if we lost it, then we've got to submit to American leadership. And that was the key problem in our relationship with the West, because we didn't want to submit. There were no reasons for that, because we didn't take part in the Cold War. It was an ideological confrontation of the Soviet Union. And we discarded that ideology. But unfortunately, they wanted to dominate the world. And whatever we did, and the expansion of NATO, and double expansion of NATO and the European Union, was supposed to bring the West closer to our Western border. We always expressed concerns over that movement of the Western military infrastructure within NATO towards our borders. It's not that Russia came to the West. It was the West that was moving towards Russia. And you see, initially, when the decision was made in 1994 to expand NATO, even against the verbal assurances that were given to the later Soviet leadership, Mikhail Gorbachev in particular, that NATO would not expand an inch after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that wasn't, you see, it meant that the Western elites were not trustworthy. And that was a problem in particular in the course of the Ukrainian crisis, which was provoked by the Western interference. You see, first they wanted to make a sort of an example of Westernization in case of Ukraine, but it was a too corrupt state. It was in fact a failed state, and that was in particular the reason why the Ukrainian elites decided to play that role, to be spearheading the anti-Russian policy of the West. If you remember what they said 2 or 3 years ago, they did say that they were the most powerful army in Europe, that they wanted to defeat us militarily on the battlefield. And then it was clear that it was not going to be the case. The Americans, you see, they said that Russia will suffer a strategic defeat. It's also nowhere to be seen. That's why they got, you see, they've got to admit that they have failed in their Ukrainian adventure, or they just continue to do whatever they started to do. You know that in April 2022, in Istanbul, in the course of the bilateral talks, we've reached an agreement with the Kiev government, and it met our demands for disarmament, not disarmament, but demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. But then Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said it wasn't going to be the case, that the Kiev and the Ukrainian army, they've got to continue fighting. And they've been fighting ever since for more than 2 years. And I think that so they've got to bear full responsibility for the bloodshed and destruction that have been the consequence of that decision by the West and Kiev.
Mr. Kramarenko, from media reports, we know that a very large volume of Western military hardware sent to Ukraine is ending up into the hands of terrorists and jihadists. By having free access to weapons, do you think the entire world, including the nations in the global south, should feel worried about intensifying terrorist attacks or terrorist threats?
Yes, we have always been saying, and we continue to say that at every level, that the conflict between Ukraine and Donbass is fueled by the supply of military hardware and munitions by the West. If they stopped that, the conflict would have stopped, and we could find a diplomatic solution to the conflict. In fact, we did find that solution more than 2 years ago in Istanbul in April 2022. But they don't want this conflict to stop. They still want us to bleed militarily, to bleed economically, although the sanctions haven't stopped our economic growth. In fact, they contributed to our economic growth, and they've been quite destructive for the West, in particular for the countries of the European Union. And certainly we say that just because we are dealing with a very corrupt state, which is Ukraine, that all the weapons and military technologies that were supplied to Ukraine, they've been finding their way through various channels to terrorist groups. And it's no coincidence that that Ukraine has turned into a terrorist state, because although they did say they wanted to fight Russia and to defeat us militarily, they started just losing on the battlefield. They started to act as a terrorist state because they use those quadrocopters and all sorts of munitions, including artillery ordnance pieces provided by the West, especially by the Americans, cruise missiles and the like, to attack our civilians and civil facilities, which have nothing to do with military action. That's why you are quite right that that is a dangerous development that will the rest of the world will have to deal with the consequences of this arbitrary, I would say, decision of the West to try to submit Russia through this Ukrainian conflict to its will.
You know that while Zelensky is hosting Ukrainians to the war field, he has been receiving hundreds of billions of dollars from the West, which definitely are not donations. Once the war ends, Western landers will want a refund of this huge amount from Ukraine. What is, in your opinion, about this tremendous debt burden Ukrainians would face for decades in repaying these hundreds of billions of dollars?
You see, it all brings us to the nature of the conflict. It's not a conflict between us and Ukraine. Just Ukraine, the Ukrainian elites, they've agreed to be spearheading the proxy aggression of the West against Russia. That's why money doesn't matter. Certainly, you see, the most important thing is that Russia is standing in the way of the Western domination in the world. They want to crush us. They didn't, at the level, for example, at the level of political scientists, the Americans, they don't conceal their objectives. The objective is to destroy Russia, to dismember it, and to solve the so-called Russian question of the West once and for all, a sort of a final solution for Russia. You see, they've tried it under Napoleon, they've tried it under Hitler, but they've never succeeded in that. Whatever the regime there was in Russia, whether it was a Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. And now it's Russia, which is a democratic state, and I'm sure that they are not going to defeat us. That's why it does not matter.
And actually, due to this, the Western, in particular, the American hostility and hegemonic tendency attitude towards many nations in the world, there is a growing interest amongst the countries in the world, including in the countries in the global south. They are willing to join BRICS because they now understand that every nation, especially in the global south, they need to become more unitedly confronting this kind of the Western hostility. And as you mentioned that Bangladesh needs fertilizer, food grain, also crude oil, and most importantly now Bangladesh is having its first nuclear power plant with the Russian Rosatom. Rosatom is implementing this project, and Bangladesh is also looking for more smaller sized nuclear plant, a nuclear power generation plant with the collaboration of Russia. So yes, this sanction, unjust and I'd say illegal sanction, is causing lots of sufferings to many countries in the world, every country in the world, in fact, including the Americans themselves. They are also suffering. So we definitely do hope that good sense prevails into the thoughts of the Western policymakers and American policymakers. And just my final question to you, sir, that as we can sense, understand also that there will be a change in the American leadership with Donald Trump possibly winning a landslide on November 5th election, and that would be end of any funding for Zelensky. So under that scenario, I mean, when there is no fund and no help from the West, actually Zelensky is already sensing it, and that's why he is now proposing a summit which should be he wants Russia to participate that summit. So under these kind of when the new leadership in the US and no help for the Zelensky anymore, what happens to him? I mean, he is no more the president. He is an ex-president. His tenure expired on 20th of May. So what happens to him?
It's difficult to say, but I can tell you that we are not going to destroy Ukraine. We deplore that the Ukrainian elites, they've been incompetent to the point that they allowed their country to be used by the West against Russia. Like Nazi Germany was used by the West against Russia. You know that Washington, Paris, and London, they appeased Hitler in the hope to rearm him, to bring him into a military form that he could invade the Soviet Union, what he in fact actually did. But he preferred to invade the western part of Europe first, in the first place, and then invade the Soviet Union. Yes, as regards the future of Ukraine, it's for the Ukrainians to decide. But you know that the present elites of Ukraine, they embarked on a very dangerous path of aggressive nationalism. They started Ukrainization in the country, which never existed before the Soviet Union. In fact, it is the Soviet Ukraine with Soviet borders. And within that Ukraine, which was quite tolerant towards Russian-speaking, and it was not a minority, a Russian-speaking people in that country, but they started to impose Ukrainian language upon them. Although many Ukrainians who spoke Ukrainian themselves, they spoke Russian at the same time. And it was a language that helped to communicate different sections of society within Ukraine. And that was the legacy, the legacy of the Soviet Union, which they have decided to discard in order to be nationalistic to the point of being aggressive towards Russia. And naturally, if they wanted to de-Sovietize, then they've got to abandon the Soviet borders, which is in fact happening. If they don't want to have anything to do with the Soviet Union, with the Soviet past, our common past, by the way, then they've got to let other people go who don't want to live in a country under the rule of an aggressive nationalistic regime. That, in fact, they have started to destroy their own country. What is going on now in the battlefield, that is the continuation of that self-destruction of Ukraine. But we always be willing, and I think that President Putin recently put forward our conditions for a diplomatic solution of the conflict. We are not going to destroy Ukraine as a state, but they are destroying their own state with their own hands, like the West is destroying itself economically through sanctions imposed on Russia. Maybe America is less concerned with that sanctions blowback, but the European Union is affected severely to the point that they don't know what to do. They are deindustrializing themselves, including Germany, and America is reaping the benefit of the Europe's deindustrialization, because they've got to reindustrialize. But to reindustrialize, they've got to destroy economically the allies in Europe. Yes, as regards Zelensky, yes, I think it's for the Ukrainian people and the West to decide. It's not for us to decide, but
Right.
he has committed crimes against his own people, including what he did after the coup of February 2014, that is 8 years ago, when legitimate president Viktor Yanukovych was deposed in a violent, what they called revolution. But revolution was nationalistic. It was to purge, in fact, Ukraine of anything having to do with the Soviet past or Russia, including the Russian language. They banned the Russian language for people who were born Russian speakers. That is awful. That is sort of Nazi, I would say it's a Nazi crime. It's real Nazism, because their national heroes are those who collaborated with Nazi Germany and who committed crimes against humanity under German command and on their own against not only Jews, Russians, but also Poles. That's why we cannot, I would say that this time of aggression against us, it's not only a civilizational war, it's a danger, it's a threat to Russia at the level of identity and history. That's why we've got to push hard to defeat it.
Mr. Kramarenko, Alexander Mikhailovich, thank you so much for giving your precious time to us, and we look forward to talking to you again. And the viewers, we were talking to Mr. Kramarenko, Alexander Mikhailovich, Director of the Institute of Cultural International Problems, Current International Problems of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Kramarenko, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Always at your service. Thank you. Bye-bye.